Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughn Manor, where Roger and I have returned. A day late. We've returned a day late. We missed Epic Comic Book Wednesday, Roger. We missed it. Sorry. Dozens of people are probably disappointed. But have no fear, because today is Epic Comic Book Thursday. Sure, that's what it is. Epic Comic Book Thursday. We're making up for yesterday by talking about a comic book thing. And the comic book thing I'm talking about today is my next read in my Marvel master plan. My master plan to read volume 1 of every major Marvel character. And I read every issue of Thor from the first run of Thor. And I am currently nearing the end of reading every issue of Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four, which ran from 1961 until 1996 when it was canceled because of the whole Heroes Reborn nonsense in the mid-90s. Marvel Comics was troubled in the mid-90s. Bankruptcy, all kinds of issues it had during the 1990s. So, yeah, Fantastic Four fell victim to this. Fell victim to the Heroes Reborn gimmick, which Steve and I ought to talk about on Epic Comic Wednesday one of these days. We will. One of these days we will. And I'm nearing the end of the 1990s Fantastic Four, and I've been thinking about the next thing I'm going to read, and I had up to this point thought I was going to be reading Captain America next, because Captain America is actually my favorite Marvel superhero, but coming real close is The Amazing Spider-Man. And The Amazing Spider-Man is, without a doubt, the most important comic book character that Marvel Comics ever did. Created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and first published in 1962. The Amazing Spider-Man is a very important character. And I thought, well, maybe I should just go ahead and read Spider-Man, which is more of a challenge than Thor and the Fantastic Four in that there are more issues. The first run of The Amazing Spider-Man lasted longer. Spider-Man sold better than a lot of other comic books from Marvel at the time in the 90s. And so Spider-Man was immune from the whole Heroes Reborn nonsense and survived cancellation and being brought back as a new #1 issue at the time. But only a couple years later, Spider-Man, The Amazing Spider-Man, did indeed reach the end of Volume 1 with issue 441. It was canceled and brought right back in a new #1 issue, simply as a gimmick, simply to generate sales, which is something that has just continued on in the land of comic books, in Marvel and DC. Every few years, they'll cancel their superhero titles and bring it back with a new #1 issue, usually with a new creative team, just as a gimmick to generate sales. It just happened with Batman, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. It happens every few years. And it's annoying. It's really annoying, especially if you're trying to keep track of the publication of the characters over the years. It's like, well, there's 15 #1 issues you have to keep track of. It's an annoying thing. And it didn't used to happen. This used to be a very unusual thing. But beginning with the 1990s, that's when this trend began. So The Amazing Spider-Man actually had a pretty good run for Volume 1. 441 issues is not bad. And The Amazing Spider-Man, enormously popular and very important. And so how am I going to go about reading it? Mostly through these. This is a Marvel Epic Collection, which collects, like this is Volume 4, and it collects issues from 1967 to 1968. I collect Marvel Epic Collections, and I have every Spider-Man Epic Collection, and I will mostly be reading them in Epic Collections, but there are some gaps in these. There are some issues that have not, as of yet, been published in Marvel Epics. I'll kind of show you. Hold on.
So I'll probably be reading, well, I'll definitely be reading most of Spider-Man Volume 1 through the Epic collections that I've collected over the years. I've got every Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man Epic collection that's been published, and they've been publishing them well over 10 years. But the Epic collections were not published chronologically. They would skip around. So there are gaps in the series that they still haven't published yet. And at the moment, like there's a gap before this, there's a gap right, actually there's a kind of a big gap before this if I'm remembering right. There's another gap here, there's another gap here. Then we have a full run right up until the end here, but it ends, I think, with Amazing Spider-Man 399. So after that, I'll probably have to read everything. I think every issue of the original run of The Amazing Spider-Man is available electronically, so I probably will do it that way. And for the gaps over here, I do have Marvel Masterworks digitally. I have digital issues of Marvel, digital editions of Marvel Masterworks that cover that material, so I'll have to read it that way. Same thing with the Fantastic Four. There are gaps in that I had to read digitally, which is not my favorite way to read comics, but it's the only way I can do it in this case. Yeah, so that's how I'll actually be reading this stuff.
Yeah, so that's how I'll be reading them. A combination of Epic collections and digital comics. Like I said, I have Marvel Masterworks for some of the earlier issues. The issues after issue 399, I probably will have to buy individually as digital issues if they're available. If not, I would have to actually get the original issues probably from eBay or something. So we'll see. When I get there, we'll see how I manage it. And I'm sure before I finish Spider-Man, of course, there are going to be more Spider-Man Epic collections that will have been published. So we'll see how it goes. But it's going to be interesting. Spider-Man, very important character. He was the most successful character at Marvel when it comes to doing what Stan Lee kind of intended to do with these Marvel characters, which is to make more realistic characters inhabiting a more realistic superhero universe. The Marvel universe is not realistic, but it's more realistic than, say, the DC universe in that the characters actually have personalities, which DC didn't really deal much with characters with strong personalities in the 1960s. I mean, up to that point, they just were like, they're superheroes. They're good guys. That's all you need. But Spider-Man had a very distinct personality. Of course, the Marvel Universe began really with the Fantastic Four #1. That's when the Marvel Age of comics began. And Spider-Man was an early Marvel character who was a teenager. He was a teenage kid who got his powers from a radioactive spider. Of course, we all know the origin of Spider-Man. And we all know the line, with great power comes great responsibility. That's the big line in Spider-Man, which appeared in Spider-Man's first appearance in Amazing Fantasy #15, I think it was. We all are very, very familiar with this now, but it was pretty remarkable at the time, this kind of character, because Spider-Man, unlike a lot of superheroes, is motivated at least in part by guilt. Guilt is one of his motivating forces. And because he did not stop the burglar who killed his Uncle Ben when he had a chance. He just was like, screw this, go ahead. This guy committed a crime. He's just like, I'm not going to bother with this, because Spider-Man was trying to go into show business. He wasn't trying to be a superhero. And then this same burglar killed his Uncle Ben, and this filled Spider-Man with a sense of guilt and a sense of responsibility, which his uncle was trying to teach him. And it's a comic book about a kid who has to grow up and become an adult with an adult sense of responsibility. He has all this power, and with that comes great responsibility. He feels like he needs to use this power to help other people because the one time he didn't, somebody close to him died. He has interesting motivations, but at the same time, when Spider-Man began, he was just a teenager, and he acts like a teenager. He could be a bratty kid in those early issues of Spider-Man. And he isn't always super noble. He acts like a regular human being. Sometimes he gets fed up. Sometimes he acts like a jerk. Sometimes he decides, I'm just not going to be Spider-Man anymore. But of course, he can't give it up because his sense of responsibility is too strong. As soon as he sees real trouble, he has to go into action. And he is a character that actually, unlike every other superhero in the world at the time, aged. He stopped aging at a certain point, but when Spider-Man first came out, he was growing up. He went from being a high school kid to going to college, to graduating from college, and he actually got older. I think he must have stopped aging somewhere in his early 30s, probably around 29 or 30. They're just like, okay, now you're never going to be older. And so he is frozen in time like every other superhero who's published in comic books now. But originally that was pretty interesting, and that was pretty innovative in itself. So for a while at least, Spider-Man was getting older. And the stories were tremendously entertaining. The first 30-odd issues of Spider-Man that were done by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko are some of the greatest comic books that have ever been published. And they had great villains. They were really good, those two, at coming up with villains. And just enormously entertaining. You had to find out what was going on with Peter Parker because it was riveting stuff. Particularly if you're a comic book fan who is no longer a kid and you're getting older, but you still like comics. DC Comics. I love DC Comics. I have nothing against DC Comics, but it was a different kind of comic book. And there was something just riveting about these and revolutionary about this character and these comics. Eventually, Steve Ditko left and John Romita took over. And John Romita did such a beautiful Spider-Man. There's his Spider-Man right there. He did just such a beautiful Spider-Man that it's like every artist for a long time who came after John Romita was basically doing John Romita's Spider-Man. He was just fantastic. Jazzy John Romita. And then we had different artists. And then the 1990s came when Spider-Man became tremendously popular again. But there were a lot of issues of Spider-Man that I've never read at all. There were a lot of issues that I missed when I was a kid. There were a lot of issues that I missed when I was in my early 20s because I kind of bought comic books sporadically during my 20s. And in the 90s, I just kind of moved away from Spider-Man. I'm not sure. I think definitely by the Clone Saga, I was done. So there are a lot of issues from that first volume of Spider-Man that I've never read at all. There's a lot of issues that I haven't read since I was a little kid. When I was a little kid in the 1970s, I would get random issues of Spider-Man and read them. But I haven't read some of those issues since. So it'll be interesting to read Spider-Man through these early decades of Spider-Man up through the 90s. Of course, Spider-Man has continued to be tremendously successful. He's been in movies and cartoons and everything else. He is Marvel's big success story next to the X-Men. And so it's going to be tremendous fun to revisit or visit for the first time a lot of these issues. And it's going to take a while. 441 issues. That's a lot. That's a lot. So I'm going to be reading a lot of Spider-Man. I'll be telling you all about Spider-Man on my weekend reading reports. Like I said, just as soon as I finish the Fantastic Four. And I've got a few years left in the 90s of the Fantastic Four. But it shouldn't take long, I think, to get through those final issues. And on to Spider-Man. Okay, I will shut up now. That's all I had to say this morning, Roger. Just making up for the loss of Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.